Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the 51%, a show about women reshaping our world. Coming up, 20 years on after the fall of Saddam Hussein, we meet Iraqi female activists who are still facing a massive uphill battle in their fight for equality. Also, how the Israeli government's controversial judicial reforms could pose enormous risks to Israeli women. I'll be talking shortly to leading feminist Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari. And with India on the brink of surpassing China and becoming the world's most populous nation, the number of women in its workforce, however, continues to decline. But first, 20 years ago, the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq was seen as a key opportunity to improve women's rights in the nation. But in reality, there's been close to little progress on gender equality as Iraqi society remains extremely patriarchal. We meet the women who are determined, however, to push for women's rights regardless.
Saddam Hussein's regime fell 20 years ago, but the status of women in Iraqi society remains far from what many hoped in 2003 when the country's new government was being formed.
The rights and freedoms that we want for women, well, we want to speak, we want to walk in the streets without being looked at in a bad way or underestimated by others.
Even if we talk and ask for something, who's going to listen to our demands? No one. We demand things and ask for what we need, but nothing is ever achieved.
It's better now than it has been in previous years, but I hope these women carry out their representative roles in a proper way, like working to improve services and infrastructure for all citizens.
The issue of female representation in politics was a great struggle in the years following the US-led invasion of Iraq. Women had no place in parliament under Saddam Hussein. Hannah Edouard has been fighting for human rights for over 50 years. She remembers the writing of the Constitution as a pivotal moment.
From the beginning, we insisted on one important issue, the quota of women. We demanded that no less than 40% of representatives in Parliament and provincial councils be women.
It was only a partial victory. When the Constitution was finally ratified in 2005, it stipulated that only 25% of seats should be reserved for women. But thanks to this, Noor Al-Julihawi was able to enter Parliament 16 years later. She first got involved in politics in Baghdad's Tahrir Square during the 2019 protests against the mainstream political parties.
Those parties were giving positions to women just to fill the quota order by law. We need to empower women. These political parties were bringing in weak women with no political experience on purpose.
In reality, women's rights in Iraq have made little progress in 20 years. Iraqi society remains broadly patriarchal and tribal codes often apply. The core struggle of human rights activists today is to better protect women against violence, and they continue to fight for new legislation.
Staying in the Middle East and amid soaring Israeli-Palestinian tensions, Israel itself continues to witness mass protests as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government seeks to weaken the Supreme Court while limiting judicial independence. Critics say the move upends Israel's system of checks and balances and pushes it towards autocracy. As well, feminists say these government reforms, due to the growing influence of its ultra-Orthodox partners, will have a massive impact on women's rights. Joining me now from Jerusalem is Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari, a founding director of the Ruckman Centre for the Advancement of the Status of Women at Bar-Ilan University. Professor, thank you so much for your time. This government is Israel's most right-wing ever and is overwhelmingly male. Only 9 out of 64 members of the coalition are women, but it's the ultra-Orthodox parties that is sparking concern. Tell me, why is that the case?
So you're right. This is the most right-wing and religious government that we ever had. And if you look at the coalition itself, the ultra-Orthodox and the national ultra-Orthodox parties together have a majority, even more than the Likud party, which is the largest party, and it is the party of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And the worry is that they now can have unlimited power to legislate not only the judicial overhaul, which they are planning to do, but a variety of legislation that will really backslide not just the democracy in Israel, but severely harm women's rights and women's status and all the gains that we worked for to achieve over the last 75 years will be totally drawn back in terms of women's rights.
But can you tell me in more detail what exactly is also under threat with these reforms when it comes to the status of women?
Part of the upcoming legislation is to expand the power of religious courts, rabbinical courts within them, and recall that there are no women in these religious courts. There is no woman religious judge in the rabbinical court. So this is one example. So Israel has never been a full democracy in this sense. Now, looking at the agreements between the coalition parties that we just mentioned before, we see a long list of laws that will curtail women's rights, such as the legalization of openly gender discrimination on the basis of religious belief. There is upcoming legislation to further legalize gender segregation in public spaces and in the academia as well, on public transportation, for instance. There is a long list of other laws, but we also have to look at the larger picture, which, as you mentioned at the introduction, that the plan is to weaken the power of the Supreme Court. And it is the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice, which actually had the largest role in providing for women's rights throughout the years. And once this court is weakened, the risk is that all the legislation, the discriminatory legislation, can pass through without anybody to stop it.
But at the end of the day, the problem in Israel is demographics, is it not? Where the birth rate among ultra-religious communities is far higher than other sectors of Israeli society, which means their power and influence will continue to rise.
So it's true that the birth rate of ultra-Orthodox community in Israel is actually the largest in the developed world. It is 6.6 per woman. And right now, ultra-Orthodox compose 13% of Israeli society, and their number will increase. But we also should look at the current demonstrations opposing the government plan. And what is really interesting and a cause for optimism is that there are more and more religious people joining in the protest, because many of them realize that weakening the court can eventually also harm their rights and their interests.
Yet for many outside of the country would still think of Israel as being relatively progressive when it comes to women's rights.
Well, the picture is more complex than that. Women in Israel have had to fight for their rights ever since the beginning of, and even before the establishment of the State of Israel. We even had to fight for our suffrage right. And as I mentioned before, there is no full gender equality in Israel at the moment to begin with. So the danger that we are facing now is really the greatest ever since the State of Israel was established.
Professor Halperin-Kaddari, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And finally, India is on the brink of surpassing China and becoming the world's most populous country. It's also one of the fastest growing economies, but the number of women in its workforce has been declining for years, and it's among the 20 lowest in the world. Lisa Kamenoff reports.
Sheila Singh quit her social worker job in 2020. She was one of 39 million women employed in India, compared to 361 million men. Despite resisting social stigma for years, she resigned and moved back to her hometown, defeated by the cost of living in Mumbai.
There was pressure that I wasn't looking after my kids and other things. I also felt that there's no value for me when working. Then I decided what happens happens, so I resigned and left.
Though some women are affected by a jobs crisis, most are unemployed because they stay trapped at home, taking care of the family to fulfill social expectations.
One of the reasons women had to leave even the scarce, rare employment opportunities that women have because of their caregiving role. So Indian women's workforce participation contributes to less than 20% of India's GDP.
Historic reforms in the 90s led to new work opportunities in India's cities. Millions, including women, left their villages for a better future. In 2004, the women's employment rate had peaked at 35%, but by 2022 it had dropped down to 25%. Yet social pressures continue to force women to quit their jobs and discourage others from entering the workforce. Experts estimate that by increasing its female workforce by just 10%, India could add another $552 billion to its GDP.
And that's all for this edition. We'd love to hear your suggestions for the 51%, so do get in touch with us via Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. And you can catch our previous shows on our website. So until the next program, bye for now.